There is a teenager right now who has never not known where they are. Their phone knows. Their parents' phone knows. The app knows. The car knows. There has never been a single afternoon in their entire life where no one could find them if they needed to. And if you told them that 30 years ago, a kid their exact age left the house in the morning with no phone, no GPS, no way to call home, and no way for home to call them, and that this was not considered dangerous or unusual or even worth mentioning, they would look at you the same way you look at someone describing a world that no longer exists. Because it doesn't. That world is gone. And the last people who remember living in it are between 45 and 60 years old right now. My name is Kevin, and today we're going to talk about what it actually meant to be the last generation that lived fully in one world and then watched an entirely different one arrive. Not what the internet is, not how technology changed society. That conversation has been had 1,000 times by people with whiteboards and TED Talks, and nobody needed another one. This is something different. This is about what it did to a specific group of people to grow up completely analog and then have the digital world show up during the exact years when your identity was still being built. Not before, not after, during. And what that timing produced in those people that no generation before or after them will ever have in quite the same way. Because here's the thing nobody says about Gen X and technology. It is not that they adapted to the internet. Every generation alive adapted to the internet. It is that Gen X is the only generation that genuinely knows how to live without it. And that is a completely different thing. Let us start at the beginning, the actual beginning. You grew up in a house where information was physical. If you needed to know something, you went and found the thing that contained the answer. The encyclopedia set on the shelf in the living room that your parents bought from a door to door salesman in 1974. And that smelled like a specific kind of serious when you opened it. The card catalog at the library, where every book that existed in that building lived on a small rectangle of paper in a wooden drawer, and you had to know the system to find anything. The phone book, an actual book delivered to your door every year, containing the phone number of every person and business in your area, printed on paper thin enough to see through. If someone was not in the phone book, you did not have their number. That was the end of that. And maps, paper maps that folded in a specific way that nobody could ever refold correctly after the first time, and that lived in the glove compartment of every car in America in a state of permanent dishevelment. You learned to read a map before you learned to drive. Not because someone taught you in a class, because if you could not read a map, you could not get anywhere. Navigation was a skill, a real one, the kind that lived in your hands and your eyes and your sense of direction, not in a device in your pocket. Now, here's where it gets specific for Gen X women versus Gen X men, because this is both sides of X and both sides matter. For Gen X boys, the physical information world meant something particular. It meant that knowing things was a form of status. The kid who had memorized the stats of every player on every team. The kid who could navigate from memory. The kid who knew how things worked because he had taken them apart and put them back together. Knowledge lived in people, not in searches. And the people who had it were respected for having it. For Gen X girls, the physical information world meant something different. It meant that connection was also physical. Notes passed in class, handwritten on folded paper, with a specific origami fold. That meant this is for you, and not for the teacher. Phone calls on a landline in the kitchen, where anyone walking through could hear exactly what you were saying, and you learned to talk in a kind of code that communicated everything to the person on the other end and nothing to anyone else in the room. Letters to friends who moved away. Actual letters, written by hand, mailed, and then you waited, sometimes a week, sometimes two, for a response that was also written by hand. That waiting built something, a tolerance for distance, a patience for connection that did not need to be instant to be real. Both of those worlds, the knowledge world of the Gen X boy and the connection world of the Gen X girl, were about to change completely, but not yet. Not for a few more years. First, you had to go to school with a typewriter. If you were born in the early 1970s, your first encounter with anything resembling a computer was in a classroom sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s. A machine the size of a small refrigerator, a screen that was green and black, text only, no pictures, no mouse. You typed commands and it responded with text, and that was the entire interaction. And a game called Organ Trail. You have died of dysentery. You know the line. Everyone who was there knows the line. But here's what Organ Trail actually was underneath the dysentery. It was the first time most Gen X kids encountered a machine that made decisions based on your input. You chose when to rest. You chose how much food to carry. You chose whether to ford the river or wait for a ferry. And the machine responded to your choices with consequences. That was new. That was genuinely new in a way that is hard to communicate to someone who has never not had it. The machine was responsive. It was not just storing information like the encyclopedia. It was reacting to you. And your brain, which had spent its entire short life learning that objects do not react, filed that experience somewhere significant. But then school let out and you went home and the computer stayed at school and the world went back to being analog until next Tuesday. That gap matters more than people think. You had a taste of something and then it went away and you went back to the phone book and the paper map and the folded note in class. And that rhythm, technology as an occasional encounter rather than a constant environment, shaped how Gen X would eventually adopt the internet in a way that is fundamentally different from every generation that came after. You knew what before felt like, so you had a reference point for after. Now let us talk about what actually arrived and when. Because the timing of the internet's arrival in Gen X lives is the thing that makes this generation psychologically unique in ways that have never been properly named. If you were born in 1965, you were in your late 20s when the internet started becoming a civilian thing. You already had a job, maybe a marriage, maybe a kid. Your identity was largely formed. The internet arrived as a tool for your already established life. If you were born in 1980, you were a teenager when the internet arrived. You grew up with it from adolescence. It shaped your social world from the beginning of your social world. But if you were born between 1968 and 1976, right in the thick of Gen X, the internet arrived at the specific moment when you were transitioning from adolescence into early adulthood, old enough to have a fully formed analog childhood behind you, young enough to adopt the new world without it feeling like learning a foreign language. You were standing at the border exactly when it opened, and you walked through. Here's what that moment actually looked like. It was not dramatic. It did not feel like the future arriving. It felt like a phone that made a terrible sound. The dial-up sound. If you know it, you are already hearing it right now. That specific sequence of tones and static and negotiation between two machines, deciding to talk to each other. You sat in front of a computer, probably a beige desktop that your family had acquired, with a mix of excitement and financial anxiety, and you waited for that sound to finish. Sometimes a minute, sometimes more. And then you were connected to what exactly was not always clear at first, but you were connected. And the first thing a significant number of Gen X people did with that connection was look for other people, not information, people, AIM, AOL, instant messenger. If you were in college or just out of college in the mid to late 1990s, you remember the specific sound of a door opening that meant someone on your contact list had just signed on. You remember building your away message with the care of someone writing a personal statement. You remember the particular anticipation of seeing a name appear that you had been hoping would appear. The crush who just signed on. The friend from home who you had not talked to since August. The conversation that started at 10 at night and was still going at 2 in the morning because you were young and the internet was new and you had things to say that the phone in the kitchen did not allow you to say. And here is the psychological piece that matters. Gen X used the early internet primarily as a communication tool before they used it as an information tool. Not because that is all it was, because human connection was what they were hungry for. These were kids who had grown up with connection that required effort. The pass note, the handwritten letter, the phone call in the kitchen in code. And suddenly here was a way to connect that was private and immediate and available at midnight, and did not require your parent to drive you anywhere. Of course, that is what they ran toward first. But here's the split, and this is the both sides part that most people miss entirely. Gen X men and Gen X women used the early internet differently in ways that reflected exactly what each of them had been building toward in the analog world. Gen X men went toward information and mastery. Forums about cars, about music, about sports, about how things worked. The early internet as an extension of the encyclopedia on the shelf. A place where knowledge still meant something, and the person who had the most of it was still respected for having it. The only difference was the knowledge was now infinite and available at 2 in the morning. Gen X women went toward connection and community. Early chat rooms, message boards where people talked about real things that the kitchen phone had never allowed them to say out loud. Health questions they had been too embarrassed to ask a doctor. Parenting decisions they had been too uncertain to admit out loud. Grief that had nowhere else to go. The early internet as an extension of the pass note, a place where connection was still the point. The only difference was the person on the other end could be anywhere in the world and could not see your face. Both of those uses produced something. The Gen X man, who spent his early internet years in forums and information, spaces developed a kind of confident navigation of digital environments that served him well when the internet became the entire infrastructure of professional life. The Gen X woman, who spent her early internet years in community spaces, developed a kind of fluency in online connection and communication that is now the entire operating system of social media. She was doing it first, 20 years before anyone called it content creation or community building or digital communication strategy. She was just talking to people on a screen because the kitchen phone was not enough. Now let us talk about what happened when the internet got fast. Because dial up was one world and broadband was a completely different one. Dial up internet was still a destination. You went to it, you sat down, you waited for the sound, you did the thing you needed to do, you disconnected, you went back to your life. The internet and your life were still two separate things with a border between them. Broadband collapsed that border. Suddenly, the internet was always on, always there. Not a destination you traveled to, a layer on top of everything. And Gen X was into their late 20s and early 30s when that collapse happened. Old enough to remember when the border existed, young enough to adapt to the world without it. And that memory, that specific embodied knowledge of what a life without constant connection felt like, is something no generation after Gen X carries. Millennials were children or teenagers when broadband became normal. Gen Z has never experienced dial up as anything other than a historical curiosity. But Gen X remembers. They remember what boredom felt like before the phone filled every quiet moment. They remember what it felt like to be unreachable, not lost, not in danger, just unreachable. Sitting somewhere with their own thoughts and no incoming signal, and that being completely fine. They remember writing something down to look up later instead of looking it up immediately. They remember conversations that ended without resolution because nobody had the answer in the room, and that being an acceptable outcome. They remember waiting for information, for connection, for responses, and they remember that the waiting was not always uncomfortable. Sometimes the waiting was just life. That memory is rarer than it sounds, and it produces something in the people who have it that is genuinely difficult to teach to someone who does not. It produces the ability to be alone with their own mind without it feeling like a problem to be solved. It produces a relationship with silence that is not anxious. It produces a tolerance for not knowing something immediately that younger generations find genuinely difficult to access. These are not small things. In a world that is now built entirely around constant stimulation, constant connection, constant information availability, the people who know from lived experience what the alternative felt like are the ones who can choose when to step back from the noise. Not because they are technophobes, not because they failed to adapt, because they adapted completely and still remember what was there before. That is a different kind of relationship with a technology than anyone younger than them has ever had. And it is a different kind of relationship with themselves. Here is the thing that connects all of it. Gen X is the only generation in human history that will ever have grown up entirely without screens and also built their professional and personal lives entirely with them. That window closed when they crossed into adulthood. It will never open again. Every generation after them will have grown up with the technology already present. Every generation before them finished their formation before the technology arrived. Only Gen X stood in both places: analog childhood, digital adulthood, the paper map and the GPS, the card catalog and the search engine, the pass note and the text message, the dial up sound and the always on connection. And what that produced is a generation that can function in either world because they actually lived in both. Not as a transition, not as an adaptation, as two complete and separate lived experiences that exist inside the same person simultaneously. The teenager who read a paper map is still in there, right next to the adult who navigates by phone without thinking about it. And when the phone dies, when the signal disappears, when the technology fails and everyone around them starts to panic, Gen X does something that confuses every generation watching. They look around, they get their bearings, they figure out which way is north, and they start moving because they already know how to do this. They learned it a long time ago, before the internet told them where to go. Thanks for watching. Both sides of X. See you in the next one.